Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, if you could hold your table talk for a few moments, we're going to begin our program. I would like to ask our president, Jay Doherty, to come up to the dais and to introduce candidate for president of the United States, Mayor of South Bend, Mayor Pete.
Thank you, Ed, and also thank you to all our board members. I know she was mentioned, but I wanted to acknowledge the City Club tries to encourage everyone to give back in the same rich measure we've received. And I wanted to especially acknowledge a woman who is a young Park District employee, came up with this athletic competition called the Special Olympics. She's with us today, Supreme Court Justice Ann Burke. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, Justice. Our guest today is a candidate for the Democratic nominee for President of the United States of America. He is in his 8th and final term or year as mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Our guest today served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy Reserve and took an unpaid 7-month leave during his mayoral term to deploy to Afghanistan. He is a Rhodes Scholar and a graduate of Harvard University, the neighborhood where he grew up with their 2 rescue dogs, Truman and Buddy. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Mayor Pete.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, goodness. Thank you very much. Please. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, for the kind invitation. Thank you, Jay Doherty, for hosting us. I want to acknowledge Frank Paul for cooking up the idea of inviting me here and persuading somebody else to go along with it. So thank you to Frank. And it's a real pleasure to be back in Chicago. When I was a consultant, I lived at Wabash and State. I worked at between Clark and Dearborn and Monroe. I guess I was between Wabash and State on Monroe, so I had about a 1-block commute, which I've not been able to replicate. And it's here in what really amounts to spectacular weather by our Midwestern standards. As you know, I'm from South Bend, Indiana. You get on Lakeshore Drive, South Bend very well. There's more than that. One thing I find myself doing as mayor, though, is explaining South Bend a little bit to people who don't know our city, who know perhaps one thing about our community, which is our magnificent University of Notre Dame, which, though it sits technically outside of limits, city limits, we're very happy to claim. And yet, because of that, people sometimes assume that we must be a tidy, wealthy, homogeneous college town, which is, of course, not our story. Our story is that of a company town that had to figure out for the balance of my lifetime what to do after you lose your company. And in that sense, we are typical of so many communities in the industrial Midwest that were left wondering what their future was going to look like. The Studebaker Car Company stopped making cars 20 years before I was born. And yet 30 years after that, when I was running for mayor, some people were still talking about it as if we could only get some version of Studebaker back making cars again, our city would be all right. That was how profound the blow of losing some of those jobs had been for us. And what we had to face was that the future wasn't going to look like the past, that the way out of the abandoned factories and the collapsing homes and the population loss and the reduced impossible again, but rather to make sure that the future looked different from the past. And that's what we've been able to achieve as a city in the last 10 years. I'm so proud of it. I won't subject you to a full accounting of all of the things we're pleased with, from the Parks and Recreation upgrades to being able to double down on our boast of having the smartest wastewater system in the world. But what I will do is let you know that we're growing, that our population is growing, that our economy is growing, that we are seeing people lifted out of poverty. We're not there yet. We've got a long way to go in our city. We're celebrating the fact that our per capita personal income has finally gone back above $20,000 in our community. But we're also seeing that our neighborhoods have become cleaner and safer. We're seeing a downtown come back to life in the same way that towns of the biggest cities have come back to life. There wasn't much to do after hours when I made that choice to live in the Loop in 2007. Miller's would give you a spinach pie, and that was about it. Now I come back and I find that even the heart of the commercial business district of this city feel it in some ways. And we've seen that smaller cities can experience that growth too, but only if we properly balance what's happening in our neighborhoods and our lowest income areas with the tremendous potential of the return to our downtowns. What really made it work in South Bend was recognizing that we couldn't just make South Bend great again, that we couldn't rewind, that we had to accept that the future was going to be different than the past. Be honest about it. Be honest that certain things were not coming back, but we were. And then talk about how. That's why I think there's no such thing as honest politics around the word again. But I do believe that there can be a very optimistic politics for the industrial Midwest. And it's so important at a time when we're being characterized by the White House and caricatured sometimes by the commentators as a place where the way to our heart. Even I think that we have the good and bad fortune of living in a moment that will be as memorable as the beginning of the New Deal or the beginning of the Reagan era. In other words, what will happen in the next 3 or 4 years could set the tone for what will happen in the next 30 or 40. And it's one of the things that motivated me to make the admittedly improbable choice of stepping up as a late 30s midterm mayor to run president of the United States. Not admittedly an obvious career move. And I get that. Just take us seriously when I publicly at a U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Washington, January. And yet we stayed in Washington for a few more years before you actually living in a moment that's kind of local if things get done. Our politics aren't ferocious and intense. I am, after all, addressing a Chicago audience. And yet, even in our most ferociously contested moments, you don't talk about a city government shutting down. We just have to get it done. And it's one of the reasons I believe our task is to start to get Washington to look a little more like our best run cities and towns before the reverse starts to happen. Because I fear that that is exactly the trajectory we might be on. I also know that our part of the country isn't known for producing a lot of Democrats, certainly a lot of progressives. Again, it's precisely for that reason that I want the country to hear voices from Midwestern states like ours, from conservative states like mine. And it's why I think there needs to be a new generation stepping up too. You know, my generation currently is on track to be the first in American history to earn less than our parents if we don't do something to change the trajectory. If you were born when my mother was born, 1945, you had a 90% shot of coming out ahead of your parents. You could more or less assume that that would happen. And for us, it's a coin flip. Some parts of the country, not far from where we're gathered, it's less than 50-50. And so we've got to make sure that that generation's putting forward leaders too. We're also the generation that produced the bulk of the troops after 9/11. We're the generation that we're not the ones who invented the internet, but we figured out some pretty interesting things to do with it. Many of them beneficial. Some of them not. All the more reason why it's of tremendous importance that the people in the policy world in charge of figuring out the left and right boundaries for that have a sense of what it is they're regulating. Not that you have to be from a new generation to do it. Again, it's an older generation that actually invented this stuff. But that we have to pay attention to, and it can't hurt to have some digital natives entering that conversation, not just in the business and philanthropy world, but in the policy world too. So having that different background, that background of a millennial Midwestern mayor, I think has equipped me to offer maybe a different vocabulary for what my party stands for. And I do not seek to shift the center of gravity morally of where my party is. But I do think it would make sense for us to find new ways to talk about it. And it's the main thing I want to discuss with you before we go to questions. There's a lot of hand-wringing over whether Democrats are capable of expressing themselves in bumper sticker language. We are given to long and elaborate policy discussions sometimes, and that's not a demerit. We're policy people. We ought to be. Policies are how we do good in this world. But sometimes I fear we have neglected to vindicate the values that motivate our policies. Something that I think the right, for at least as long as I've been alive, the values that we believe what we believe. So that even people who maybe have different values or have different conclusions on policy understand that we came by our views honestly. And it's why I think that this campaign largely must be about freedom. Now, when you think of freedom, when you think of liberty, and you think of whose lips you would expect it to be on in the political world today, you're mostly going to think of people from the right. You're going to think of our conservative friends who are preoccupied with making sure that the government does not restrict. And often that leads to positions on regulation that suppose that if government is the opposite of freedom, then less government means more freedom. Although it turns out that there are some exceptions to this rule, some of which we're observing in the American South today. Now, I come from Indiana as a Democrat. There are people I love, people I trust, people who support me politically, who view this issue differently than I do. But I must say that I don't think that you are free in this country if your reproductive health can be criminalized by government dictatorship. This is not an easy choice for anybody to face. And I would be loath to tell anybody facing that situation what the right thing to do is. But that's exactly the point. I'm a government official. I don't view myself as belonging in that conversation. And to see in Alabama that if someone is raped and she seeks an abortion, the longer prison term to rapist makes me question whether the discussion about freedom in this country has gone off the rails. Let me, though, suggest that there is more to freedom on the left or on the right than just getting government out of the way. One of the reasons we invented government as a species is because there are certain freedoms we don't enjoy unless we have policies that tear down the obstacles to us living a life of our choosing. Even the most unglamorous things that mayors work on day in and day out, wastewater and water, I believe are things that enhance our freedom because we have municipal authorities to worry about that sort of thing so we don't have to. But it's also why you're not free, as we learned in Flint, if you have to wonder whether a glass of water that comes out of the tap is going to poison you and your family. It's providing basic services. And it's providing some measure of assurance that the rights that you have in this country and in this life will be secured. It's why I think healthcare is freedom. And I think you're not free if the United States has failed to ensure that you might, for example, be able to start a small business, leaving your old job and starting a new one without fearing that that means you'll lose your healthcare. I think that you're not free as a consumer if a financial institution is caught ripping you off and you don't have any recourse because you've been forced into arbitration. How to lift the veil of mistrust, for example, between communities of color and the law enforcement officers sworn to keep them safe, how can we really say that we're enjoying freedom? And of course, on a more personal note, I don't think that you can really say that you're free if a county clerk gets to tell who you ought to marry based on their view of their own religion. So let's talk about freedom in its richest sense and recognize that good government can help make you free just as much as bad government can help make you unfree. And that how big or small it is only the beginning of the conversation. I want to talk about security because that's another thing that I think has been maybe monopolized by our friends on the right, as though security or the flag or patriotism belong to one political party. I think that's all the more reason people in my party ought to be talking about security. First of all, traditional security issues have not gone away. We see what's going on in the vicinity of Iran right now, to give just one example. We've got to ask ourselves whether this administration is capable of stating what the bar is before you even talk about sending U.S. troops into a conflict. And I say that as somebody who went into a war zone in a few years, will be. But when I left Afghanistan in 2014, I thought I was turning out the lights. I thought I was one of the last to go. It's 5 years later. We're still there. You could be old enough to enlist and not have been alive on 9/11. And the next president's got to be ready in the name of U.S. security to put an end to endless war. Day before yesterday, we did an event with young men and women signing their commitment letters to go into the military. Some going to the academy, some are enlisting right away, some are joining the Guard. And on one sense, it's a very happy occasion. It makes me nostalgic in the way that somebody who has served inevitably and sometimes unbearably gets around young people starting to serve. And I was very proud of them. And their parents were there. And the school principals were there. It was a great event. But then there's this other voice in the back of my head. Actually, not so different than the voice that was in the back of my head when I saw high school students from the same high schools in our city gathering together in the March for Our Lives to demand better action on gun safety. And the voice in the back of my head, yeah, we can applaud that. And the voice in the back of my head saying, do not let these kids down. Do not play games with their lives. This is not a game. It is not a show. And we better make sure that the security decisions made by the president are based not on domestic politics, but on what is the right thing for this nation, and particularly those who have agreed to defend it with their lives. And that's just the traditional stuff we talk about when we think about security. This is the 21st century. That means security means cybersecurity. And one thing that will not help on cybersecurity is putting up a wall from sea to shining sea. Doesn't keep out the bits and the bytes. There's a human factor as well as a technical side to cybersecurity, and we've got to be on top of it. We've got to worry about election security. Our elections are the thing that keep us safe. Our elections, a lot more than a collection of rifles, for example, our elections are the thing that see to it that our government works for us and not the other way around. And our elections, for that very reason, have been attacked. So what are we doing to secure our elections? And what are we doing to look after security in the face of a rising tide of violent white nationalism asserting itself at home and around the world? That's security too. That's security in a really big way. And we had better be talking about what may well be the biggest security imperative of our time, which is climate security. There's evidence that the Syrian civil war began partly because of forced migration patterns that happened as a result of drought and other issues connected to climate. The same story is increasingly coming into focus when it comes to the rise of Boko Haram. in Africa. We probably would not have as many migrants at our borders from Central American countries if it weren't for climate disruption. I myself, in the city of South Bend, had to activate our emergency operations center twice in less than 2 years. One of them was for the 1,000-year flood, and the other was for the 500-year flood. Now, I'm not, but I do have an iPhone, and it's got a calculator app on it. 125,000 to 1, unless, of course, something has changed in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, just like they warned us. And that's a security imperative, adapting and preventing it from getting worse. So let's stop talking about freedom and security like they belong on one side of the aisle, and let's have an adult conversation about what it's going to take to do something about that in our century. And in order for that to happen, it brings me to democracy. We'd like to think of ourselves as a democracy. We like to think that democracy was one of the things that was on the line in some of our nation's finest moments, from its very founding to the way that we played a role in beating back tyranny around the world during the time of World War II. But are we really a democracy? Needless to say, our democracy has always been imperfect. There have been patterns of exclusion in our democracy from the very beginning. But I think it would be fair to say, on balance, most of the time, if you zoom all the way of voting rights, largely motivated by people who seem to it as a matter, that seen this happen systematically with voter ID laws, with make a principled argument by fellow U.S. citizens living in Washington, D.C., or for that matter, Puerto Rico, have less political representation than we do. Does it make any sense? Can anyone make a principled argument, or rather fit democracy, actually, is to elect the president by just counting up all the votes and then giving it to whoever earned the most? In our current environment, which is precisely why our environment needs to change. I would say we need to change the channel from the show that we've all been watching. And that's my response to this presidency. You notice I didn't talk about it much. It's not because I don't think about it rather often. It's that you don't even get a presidency like this unless something's wrong. This, by the way, is one reason people in my party need to recognize that some smoking gun proof that the president's not a good guy will not change much. A lot of people, at least where I live, voted with their eyes wide open for a guy they didn't much care for in order to send a message that they wanted to burn the house down. Which is also why any suggestion that our party's message ought to be to promise a return to normal overlooks the extent to which normal hasn't been working for a lot of people. Now, what we've got now isn't working either. But that's exactly why we've got to create a new normal. So we're not going to go on that show. We're not going to play that game. We're going to change the channel. And that's what my campaign is about. Let me close just by mentioning a word that has fallen out of fashion, but I think it's as important as ever, and that's hope. Because you don't do this if you don't have some measure of hope. Running for office is an act of hope. In a certain sense, taking the time to watch somebody talk at you who's running for office is an act of hope. And voting is, and volunteering is. You don't do this unless you think there's some way to make the pulleys and levers of our system work better and make people better off. And when you do that, when you get it right, not that anybody's ever had it perfect, but when you get it right, then I think the freedom, the security, and the democracy we live with will be greatly enhanced so that we will, in fact, by 2054, when I'm entering my retirement and celebrating the fact that I've reached the current age of the current president, that I'll be able to look back at 2020 and say, this is when things really started moving onto a good path for our country. And that's how that we succeeded, not just in an election, but in defining an era. And that's why I'm doing this. So thanks for coming. And we'll do some questions.
Thank you very much, Mayor Pete. Thank you very much for that. And we have a number of questions here. We'll try to answer as many as we can. The first one is from a former colleague of mine who's actually Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. And he wants to know, his name is Perry Arnold, what are the three most important problems our country must address going forward?
Glad you didn't want to know about the trash pickup. We had to move it to where from the back of your house to the front of your house, there's a whole thing. So let me pick up on some of the themes that I just mentioned. I'll try to do it at not too much length so that we can continue getting questions. But I spoke of climate. So let me say just a little more about what I mean when I say that climate security is an imperative. I already described the problem. Let's talk about the solution of it. First of all, I do think we need to talk about adapting now. Mayors need guidance on what to do if the floodplain isn't where it was supposed to be and won't be again. We also got to act on the front end to stop it from getting worse. I believe the basic contours of what to do are well known. We need a carbon price and dividend, or carbon tax and dividend, if you will. Let's call it what it is, be honest about it. Good news is if you rebate it back out to the American people, most of us will be made better than whole if we structure it the right way. But it'll help change our economy to move in a direction that is less carbon intensive. I think we got to have massive investment in R&D, not just on renewable energy, but on energy storage and on carbon storage, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, because it's easier to get to net zero than it is to get to absolute zero. And we got to do whatever we can. The bigger issue, I think, is that, and this will go to the second thing that I think is a big issue. We obviously have a bit of a crisis of unity in this country, no sense of common purpose. I would also argue that we need something of a national project, that America does better when it is compelled to work on something hard. Sputnik provoked a national project, for example. So did World War II. And in climate, in the problem that climate represents, we also have the makings of something that could be a solution, not just to climate, but to that deeper kind of social or even moral illness that we have as a country. For once, we have the possibility of a national project that isn't just fighting other human beings. And by the way, if we were making good on dealing with climate as a national thing from America, we might also be leading the world at a moment when we're struggling to lead the world. Imagine, for example, the terms of this US-China tug of war that's going on. If one of the corners of global security was climate diplomacy, and a nation was prestigious in its climate, that'd be a way to challenge China to catch up, but only if we had our own house in order. So climate, national unity, picking a third is pretty tough because there's so many, but let me return to democracy and just say that we had a pretty good start in H.R. 1. You know, a pro-democracy, anti-corruption bill that was passed in the House only to die in the Senate. It's the sort of down payment on deeper democratic reforms that I would want to enact the moment I got to the Oval Office.
Okay. Now we'll give you some real easy ones. This is from Joanna Camwell, I think. Joanna, where are you? Are you here? Right over there. Okay, thank you, Joanna. A couple questions came in with the same name. The writing looks awfully similar. Okay. How are you, a man, going to be a strong advocate for women as opposed to an actual woman running for office and being president?
It's a good question, and it's fair game. I think a lot of us are disappointed that we don't have a woman in office right now after 2016. I obviously am not a woman. My old employer, back when I was here at McKinsey, did a study on gender equality in corporate leadership. They looked at boards, they looked at leadership teams. And one of the things they found is that companies that were more gender inclusive in their leadership weren't just better places to work, they're actually more profitable because they made better decisions. And it's just one example of why gender inclusion and gender equality and gender diversity is not just the right thing to do in a moral sense, but it also is the right thing to do in a strategic sense. If that's true for companies, then it must also be true for countries. It's certainly true for cities. Women have had the bulk of the leadership roles in my office, and we have women in so many key roles in our cabinet and in our leadership, and I think it helps us make better decisions. From a policy perspective, there are all kinds of things we need to do, from enacting pay transparency when it comes to how large employers are, if they just have to publish the gender pay gap, I feel like some of those issues will take care of themselves once they just have to defend what they're doing. But also much more profound issues like the extent in our current healthcare reality, being a woman amounts to a pre-existing condition. And I've already shared my views on reproductive freedom. So there's the policy piece, but there's also the cultural element, right? Just, is this or is this not a country in which everyone is equal, and in which a little over than 50% of our country are represented? So I am who I am. But what I will say is that I believe the next president must be the best president ever on women's equality and gender inclusion, especially if the next president is going to turn out to be a man.
So can we take from your comments, Mayor Pete, that you would be very happy to have as your running mate for vice president? You don't have to give us any names, but a woman.
Very happy.
Okay. This is from City Club member Bonnie Allen. Bonnie, where are you? Back there. Okay. She wants to know what your position is on rights for people who are incarcerated or coming out of prison.
No question that, first of all, we are an over-incarcerated country, and we need to take a number of steps to deal with that, beginning, in my view, with an end to the private prison industry. But also including steps from sentencing reform to making sure, as we move forward legalization of marijuana, as I believe we must, that we are also pursuing a retroactive policy of expungements in order to deal with cases of incarceration where the incarceration did more harm than the offense that led to the sentence. I also believe that when people leave incarceration, not only have they finished paying whatever debt was incurred socially, but also everybody has an interest in them succeeding and contributing. And we talk a lot about helping people succeed and contribute as a part of the economy, but not enough about succeeding and contributing as a citizen. And so I believe the moment that somebody returns to their community without bureaucracy, without obstacles, and certainly without being expected to pay, which is happening in some places and amounts to a poll tax, especially when you consider the pattern of racial inequality that is behind so much of what is happening in our criminal justice system. I believe that the moment that you are out, you are a citizen, and that means you are a voter, and we should reestablish your voting rights right away. Questions deserve a full answer. So I should acknowledge that some in the activist community would like me to go a step further and extend that to those currently incarcerated. I don't feel comfortable taking that step, but I'm continuing to listen to people who have had some pretty compelling things to say about why they view that issue differently than I do. And that dialogue has been beneficial to me.
Okay. By the way, I think that there are 2 states, Maine and Vermont, that allow people who are incarcerated to vote. Okay, we've got some really good questions here. We'll try to address as many as we can. This is from Joe Kallenbach with the McHenry County Economic Development Commission. Joe, where are you? Okay. He'd like to know what can be done to revitalize economic conditions in rural and suburban communities.
Obviously, this is something I think about a lot. I'll tell you what works back home. First of all, honesty, that we're not ever going to have quite the economic patterns we used to, and recognition that we don't need to. By the way, some of this is about trade. A lot of this is about technology. I was just at not long ago at a business in South Bend makes shot peening medium. It's those little balls they fire at automotive parts at very high pressure in order to temper them. It's one example of a very kind of characteristic small to mid-sized industrial employer in our area. They do $6 or $7 million a year in business. They have 6 or 7 full-time employees. So it's about $1 million per employee. There will be fewer people required on a shop floor each passing year. But the jobs that are being created can be good paying, secure, and stable jobs. We just got to make sure people are equipped for the fact that those jobs will continue to evolve. And they have as much to do with critical thinking and dealing with what happens when there's an exception to the rule, because the quality control part is going to be bigger in an industrial setting than the kind of physical repeatable tasks will be. Then we got to equip people for that. In so many suburban or kind of middle density communities like my own have a lot of these manufacturing employers. Rural areas, I think Democratic politicians always go right to broadband because it's the thing we kind of get if we don't live in a rural community and we care about rural people. And don't get me wrong, broadband is definitely something that we need to extend in an equitable way to the American interior. But there's a lot more going on that needs to be addressed in rural America. The biggest thing, the thing that we do have in common in a community like mine that's more industrial, although it's a short jog to the nearest cornfield for me, is this idea that young people grow up getting this message that success means getting out. And nobody has to tell it to you. You just take that on board. Of course, that's what so many people do, especially in rural communities. And that can break the heart and break the energy of a community, of a family. The irony is, technology also means that for many people, there's never been less requirement that you be somewhere in particular in order to do the disparities in real estate pricing in this country. The fact that in Palo Alto, you could pay a certain amount in order to have a parking space that would be more than the mortgage on my nice big house on the river in South Bend. That we also have tremendous opportunity to better distribute where the problem. Invest heavily in, for example, what I think is a really which we can envision through soil management and other practices, what that might look like. Even though today, of course, it does not pencil out without a major subsidy. So I see tremendous opportunity for rural America. And we need to make sure that we are doing it with a view toward what the economic needs are going to be and opportunities are going to be in the next 30 years, instead of trying to find some pickled version of what it looked like in the 1950s and expect that to work in 2020.
Thank you, Mayor Pete. I've got a couple questions here that Simeon Gasparov. Simeon, where are you? Over there. Hi, how are you, Simeon? Okay. Have a seat. Don't get carried away. Simeon's from Lad right down here would like to know, and Daniel policy. Simeon's interested in Eastern Europe. Ashvin would like to know what role a country like India wants to know about, and I think you may have answered this already, the Trump administration march to war in Iran. So just a couple of easy questions.
All right, so we got Eastern Europe, India, and Iran in 90 seconds. All right. Let me offer a few thoughts. I probably can't deliver a comprehensive framework that would take all of those in within the amount of time that we've got. But each of them deserves attention regionally, and then I'll make one remark globally. So first of all, there is the idea of do no harm, but there's also great opportunity, I think, in our relationship with Eastern Europe. Needless to say, the biggest factor complicating our policy and relationships in Eastern Europe is the interventions from Russia. And having and not enjoyed an intervention from Russia, I think we could perhaps learn a lot from our incredible responses. Doesn't mean take it apart. And a good example is the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Russia has not been complying with this treaty for a long time. So the White House just through as much as I think Iran and seeing the consequences of that. Think when it comes to Iran about, first of all, how much we have undermined any hope of moderation. If you're an Iranian moderate politician and you sold people on the idea that it was going to pay off to work with the U.S., how much egg on your face do you have now on the question of whether Americans can be trusted?
Call from Wolf Blitzer. He's waiting to talk.
Well, I'm very fond of India. They're a very important ally, and we're glad we have a democratic country of that size in it.
Mayor Pete, by the way, I want to let you know you are the third candidate for president who has spoken to the City Club. The current president, before he was nominated in 2016, and he managed to eke out a victory. We had the mayor of New York, who just declared today speak, but he was not a candidate. And we wish you the absolute best in your campaign. Just pull someone's card out of. Good. Transparency. Here's the City Club of Chicago transparent coffee mug. A one-year membership in the City Club. Says presidential candidate. You may come back. I'll say president. Okay. And the winner of our $200 Maggiano Don Wary. There you go. Everybody, thank you very much. Good luck to our speaker.
This is from the Supreme Court Justice.